All right, so before beginning, guys, we're gonna go ahead and wait until about 4:10 so everyone can make it onto the live stream. But in the meantime, thank you all for coming here. We really appreciate you all taking out the time to come and watch the presentation, and we really hope it's gonna bring some value to each of you guys. So give us until about 4:10. We're gonna iron out some kinks on our side and go ahead and get the presentation started in just a few minutes. All right, we'll be getting started in just a few seconds. Awesome. So it looks like we are all ready to go, and we're going to go ahead and begin the presentation. So first of all, just like I was saying earlier, thank you all so much for being here. We are all super excited, and there's been a lot of planning going into having events like these coming up in the future. And today's a really exciting day for all of us because it kind of marks our first live series presentation from Fremont Debate Academy. Now, before really diving into the presentation, we're going to go ahead and give you a quick background of what Fremont Debate Academy is for those of you who aren't familiar, and I'm sure a lot of you are. So Fremont Debate Academy was actually a nonprofit founded by me and some of my co-founders who attend UC Berkeley and Oxford now about 6 years ago because we wanted to spread debate to our local community. Now, in the years that followed founding the organization, we have spread debate in our programs across Fremont, which is where we were founded, California, a few other states in the United States, and even India. And we're really excited to be sharing this mission with all of you guys. And our mission really is to create a debate and civics program in every school and every district across the world. So, in accordance with this goal, we've had the opportunity over the past few months to really dive into creating a really in-depth curriculum that we hope will support the programs that we plan to expand to. And we also have been able to do a lot of outreach, getting in contact with high schoolers and others in schools across the entire nation in states such as Alabama, Florida, Minnesota, Arizona, and more. And we really hope that we will be able to create new programs in each of these states ahead of our big launch that we plan to have in early fall or late summer this year. So kind of diving into more details about what this presentation is going to look like, we're going to give you guys a kind of overview of what economics really is as a science. We're going to be giving you information that hopefully will bring you value in your daily lives and will also really help you as a debater. And before we actually begin the presentation, I want to point you guys out to a few resources that we have. First of all, this YouTube channel is one of our best public resources for anyone who wants to learn about middle school debate. And also we will be posting a lot of information that is kind of not really debate related necessarily, but will teach you more about politics, economics, and other similar things over the coming few weeks. So we're really excited about that. Also, if you're watching this video and live stream right now, I would recommend that each of you go ahead and check out the Google form in the description for this video. And that Google form helps us keep track of who's watching this video so that we can make sure they're kept up to date with other important announcements regarding FDA, especially including the live series lectures that are going to be coming up tomorrow and next week. So we're really excited to share that content with you as well. And one other very important point that I want to bring up is if you have any questions throughout this entire presentation, don't be afraid to ask them because the comment stream is live, and any questions you ask and we find the time to answer, we will go ahead and answer, most likely at the end of this presentation. If anything throughout this presentation doesn't seem to make complete sense, seems to go over your head a little bit, we're going to be doing our absolute best to give you guys simple, intuitive explanations about why each of these concepts matter, why they're important, and how they can help you in your daily life and in your time as a debater. So with that, we are going to go ahead and begin by introducing ourselves. So my name is Rachit Pareek. I am a co-founder of Fremont Debate Academy and currently serve as Chief Financial Officer. And I'm also studying computer science and international business at UC Berkeley, and I'm second year there. With me, I have Richa.
Hi, I'm Richa. I'm the Vice President of Education, or one of them, and I'm a junior at Irvington High School. And as always, we're going to start off with a little joke. And today it's a little boy, and he traded a juice box for a cupcake, and he created wealth. And this is a little bit about how the economy works and shows kind of what it is, which Rachit will jump to in a little bit.
Sweet, thanks, Richa. Now, we're going to first start off by giving you guys a quick overview of what this presentation will look like. First thing I'm going to do is tell you a bit about what economics is and give you an introduction to the economy. Then we're going to dive into supply and demand, which really drive the economy, and then tell you a little bit more about some important concepts relating to economics. Then we're going to talk about the stock market, which I'm sure a lot of you are curious about and have heard a lot about in recent days. Then we're going to dive into economic systems, the different types, how they exist around the world and which countries tend to use which ones, a little bit about GDP, which is how we measure a country's wealth or the size of its economy. We're going to talk about taxes, which will be especially relevant to you in your future lives. And then we'll give you some cool quick facts about the economy that are useful tidbits to know and can also be really helpful when you're having a conversation about the economy or debating someone on an economically related topic. The first thing we're going to discuss then is an introduction to the economy. Now, before really diving into what the economy is, and I'll step back for a quick second, I want to talk to you guys about what economics is. Now, economics is a science, but it's not necessarily a science in the way that you might know of it so far. You may have heard about biological sciences, which talk about live organisms. You may have heard about physical sciences, which include things like astronomy, learning about the planets. But economics is more of a social science. And what economics really talks about is how do we humans take the resources that Earth has given us, convert them into goods and services that provide value to other humans, and then get those goods and services that we've made into the hands of the people who really need them. So that's really overall the kind of goal that an economy is able to accomplish. And so we'll talk a little bit more about economics and economy and markets in the future slides. And if anything doesn't make sense, again, I'll remind you, please put your questions in the comment stream. Cool. So diving into what is an economy a little more. So an economy is a system of producing, trading, and consuming goods or services of value. Now, I'm going to go ahead and break down that sentence a little bit. When I talk about producing, to give you guys some examples, there are basic resources that we kind of begin with in the earth. Some examples are salt water that you can get from the ocean. Another example is trees that might be in a forest. But on their own, these basic resources often tend not to be very useful to humans. We have the ability, however, to convert these basic resources into things that we can use. And to give you an awesome example, humans can't drink salt water. But what we can do is use a machine to convert the salt water into clean, pure, drinkable water that we can use. Also, for example, if we take wood that comes from trees in a forest, we can take that wood, cut the trees down, and convert that wood into many other things that are very useful for us. Things like paper, wood that's used to build houses, and many other things. So the cool thing about an economy is it's able to facilitate, first of all, the people who are going to take the resources and convert them into something that's more valuable. And then it also allows people to go ahead and come and interact with the people who are making these useful things and somehow get them into the hands of the people who need them. So when we're talking about trading goods and services of value and relying on a medium of exchange or currency, many of you may have heard of the phrase currency, which naturally makes you think about money. So specifically what we're talking about when we say medium of exchange is when people go into the market today, if you go to a store, well, in the past, what people would have to do if they wanted to get something that someone else had made or grown is they would have to directly trade them with something that they had to get what the other person had, especially if they wanted it, right? In today's world, we have a slightly different system. We have actually agreed on money, and there's many different types of money, and that's a huge other topic, but we'll talk about the US dollar in much detail today. We've agreed on money as a unit of measurement that all of us agree on so that we can use that unit of measurement to put a value on all the other things. Because you and I each agree that a US dollar is worth $1, we can use that dollar to place a standard value on all the other things that we can go out, sell, and buy. And as I discussed in the previous slide, the goal of this economy and really what it's able to do is it's able to take all of the things that people make and all of the services that people are able to create. And now differentiation between goods and services is not too complicated. Really quickly, a good is something like a product or something physical you can buy, while a service is something that someone can do for you. So an example of a good might be a smartphone, while an example of a service might be someone coming and mowing your lawn for you. But the thing is, the economy is able to take these goods and services and get them into the hands of the people who need them, or do the services for the people who need them most. Sweet. Now, Rich is going to go ahead and talk to us a little bit about who really makes up the economy.
Can you allow screen sharing really quick?
Absolutely. One moment. All right, go for it.
Awesome, thank you. All right, so we're going to be talking about basic actors right now. And so let's break down what is a basic actor. When we mean basic actors in the economy, it just means who participates in the US economy. And so the first big group of people who participate in the economy is consumers. So that's you, people like you and me. And we do this by spending money and buying products and services. And so this all adds to the economy as we're like doing multiple transactions, just like in the joke we showed you. What is a basic? Another big actor that's in the economy is investors. And so these people invest based on the potential for a good return on their money, often in business. So a good example of this would be a company that makes fidget spinners. So I'm going to come back to fidget spinners throughout the whole presentation. So I hope you like fidget spinners. But let's say you have a business that makes fidget spinners. And so as an investor, you would think, okay, fidget spinners are going to do really well, so I'm going to give my money to this company. And what this does is by giving the money to the company, they're going to be able to expand their company, make more fidget spinners and sell more, and therefore make more profits and help the economy grow. Another way that investors help the economy grow is through the stock market. And Rachit will cover this a lot more in detail in a little bit. But a really quick overview of what the stock market does and how it works is that, you know, as an investor, you would buy a stock. So stocks are shares of the invested ownership in a company. So just as I was saying before that you want to give money to the fidget spinner company to help them grow, one way you could do that is by buying their stock. Now, if you don't fully get it, that's totally okay. Rachit will go into a lot more detail on the stock market. Especially relating to today, because I'm sure you've heard a lot about it going up and down. So another one of the basic actors is businesses. So businesses produce goods and services that they can sell in an open market at prices they choose. And so again, back to what I've been saying up till now, businesses are a huge part of the economy, right? Consumers buy from businesses and businesses produce the goods that consumers buy. Then we talked about an open market that we'll talk about in a little bit, but this is just saying that businesses have the freedom to kind of operate on their own without too much of like regulation from the government. And they get to pick their prices in a way. And what's really great about businesses is competition. And so we'll come back to the fidget spinner idea, right? If there's only one company that sells fidget spinners, then they can choose what price to do it at, what type, what features it has, like the colors. And that's like hard for the consumer, right? Because they have to buy whatever that one company gives. And we would call that a monopoly. But because of competition, businesses are forced to make new features. They're forced to make more colors, make it more interesting, lower the prices. So competition can promote innovation and lower prices because they're competing with each other. I mean, would you buy a $10 fidget spinner or a $5 fidget spinner? Pretty sure you'd buy the $5 fidget spinner if the quality was the same, of course. Now, the next actor that we're going to talk about is government. This is the last one we're going to talk about, but keep in mind there are other basic actors, but these are like the biggest ones that we wanted to cover. And so the government regulates the economy to help monitor and promote economic growth. So they're basically like a regulator. And so an example of this would be Congress actually taxes citizens and companies to fund their budget. And they can spend this budget on roads, public works, infrastructure, education, healthcare. And we'll have an infographic about the federal budget at the end of the presentation. But for right now, we just wanted to kind of emphasize that the government, I like to say, is like this invisible hand that's protecting our economy, right? If it's growing too quickly or it's not growing fast enough, the government will always kind of like pitch in to help keep economic growth stable and help regulate businesses so they don't do anything unethical. So now we're going to move on to supply and demand. So supply and demand is like how the economy actually works. So prices are set by the forces of supply and demand in the economy. So prices are driven by the different supply and demand and like the forces that come with it. And so let's break down what supply and demand is. So supply is the quantity or the amount. That's a really key correlation you need to make. Quantity means the amount of a good offered for sale by producers. So back to our fidget spinners. Let's say we have 10 fidget spinners. Our supply would be the fidget spinners. Demand is the quantity or the amount of a good desired by consumers. So let's say we have like 10 consumers who want to buy fidget spinners. That's our demand, 10 people. So let's look at a graph. This is a really simple graph of how supply and demand looks like and how we kind of look at it. So this S right here represents the supply, and this D is a linear graph for demand. And so we'll go back to our example. Let's say we have a supply of 10 fidget spinners and a supply of 10 people who want to buy it. And they're going to meet at this intersection point. And so the graph is always trying to meet some sort of equilibrium. And this point is going to show us, look, the quantity is equal, right? There's equal demand and supply, and that's going to be our equilibrium price. So now let's look at what happens if we change something. So I know these graphs look kind of scary. I remember the first time I saw it, I was also really confused. So don't worry if when I'm explaining, you're a little bit confused. That's totally okay. The big idea is to just understand the big picture and like the like what we're trying to explain to you. The graphs aren't as important, but they're just a good aid. So the first graph, so this light blue line is going to be the original graph with the supply line. So if we go back, this is the original graph, and then the original graph is a light one, and then the dark supply line. And so what we're saying in the first graph is that the demand increases, right? The arrows are going right. So what happens if the demand increases? So we're going back to our fidget spinners. We have 10 fidget spinners, and originally only 10 people wanted them, so they were equal. But what if now 20 people want fidget spinners? Then we would have a greater demand than the supply. And so intuitively, what you would think is if more people want it, the value for that product will increase, right? Which would mean that the price would increase. So if 20 people want to buy it and one person says, okay, the price is too much, there's 10 other people who are willing to buy that fidget spinner from you. So that's kind of how, like, as demand shifts upward, the price will increase if supply stays the same. Now on graph 2, we're going to look at the same thing, but when demand decreases. So again, this light blue line for demand is the original demand where it's equal to the supply. Now, if the demand decreases, so the amount of people who want to buy it decreases. So let's say now only 5 kids want to buy fidget spinners, but the business has 10 fidget spinners that they're trying to sell. Well, the price is going to decrease, right? If they don't sell those 5 fidget spinners, they're going to lose more money. So they'll maybe put it on sale. So hopefully more people will buy the fidget spinners. Now, so graph 1 and 2 kind of shows what happens when you shift the demand. Now let's look at graphs 3 and 4, which is going to show us what happens when we shift the supply. So again, the demand is our constant, so this doesn't change. And then our supply is going to be this light blue line. This is the original one. And it's going to increase. The supply is going to increase. So what happens when we have 10 kids who want to buy fidget spinners? And the company overthinks that, okay, more kids are going to want it. So they produce, let's say, 20 instead of 10. So now there's only 10 kids who want it and 20 fidget spinners. Well, that's almost the same as graph 2, right? Because what happens is there's more supply than there is demand. So the price is going to decrease, so in hopes that the business will be able to sell those extra 10 fidget spinners. Now, lastly, in graph 4, we look at what happens when supply decreases, right? So this is our original graph with the light blue supply and the demand, and then it goes to the left as supply decreases. So now instead of 10 fidget spinners, maybe let's say when they were making them, 5 of them broke. And so now they only have 5 fidget spinners to sell, and there's a demand, 10 people want it. So the value of that fidget spinner is going to increase, right? Because if someone says, oh, I don't want to buy it, there's 5 other people who would buy that fidget spinner. So this is similar to graph 1, where the price would increase. Okay, so now we're going to move on to why this shift happens. So if you didn't fully understand the graphs, that's totally fine. Now I'm going to give you hopefully a more intuitive kind of reasoning for why these shifts happen. And so the biggest factor, like I talked about in all of my examples, is price, right? Price has the strongest impact on supply and demand. If the price is going to increase, a supplier or a business is going to want to sell more, because higher price means more profit. But the demand will also decrease because, who wants to buy a more expensive fidget spinner? But price is not the only factor that can cause the quantity supplied or demanded to change at the same price, right? So if we keep price the same, there are also other factors that will change the supply and the demand. So one example for supply is the production technology. So a long time ago, there was like this thing called the Industrial Revolution, where we had lots of new factories came up. So you could make more products more quickly and efficiently. And so this increased the supply of clothes that a person could offer its consumers. So that's how supply increased without actually a price change. Another example on the demand side, that a factor that affects demand, is cultural tastes, right? So this could be if we have fidget spinners, right? And then slime comes out and a bunch of kids are like, oh, I like slime more than fidget spinners. Well, then more people will want to buy slime than fidget spinners. So the demand for fidget spinners would go down and the demand for slime would increase. So now we're going to move on to some important ideas and terms that we use in economics. So the first one is scarcity. Everyone, or you all probably know what this means. It's like having a limited amount of resources, but we almost kind of overlook how it applies to economics. I know I did until I was told how it really affects something. And the idea is that every resource is scarce, right? We don't have an unlimited amount of resources. And that leads us to our costs and benefits, to maximize the benefits and minimize the costs, right? So we can only make a certain amount of fidget spinners. So when we make a fidget spinner, we want to make it for the least amount of money and sell it for the most amount of money to increase our profit. And so economics revolves around these ideas that you don't have unlimited resources. So you need to utilize what you do have and maximize your benefits and minimize your costs. Another idea we want you to keep in mind is opportunity costs. This is the profit or utility lost when picking one opportunity of another. So here I'm going to give you 2 examples. The first one is, let's say on your birthday, your parents give you the choice to either go to Disneyland or the beach, right? And you're saying, okay, I'm going to go to Disneyland. Or at least I kind of forget to think about the other side, right? We're so happy that we have the opportunity to go to Disneyland, but we don't think about what we lost. It's great that we went to Disneyland, but on the other hand, we lost the opportunity to go to the beach, right? So that was our cost. Our cost for going to Disneyland was going to the beach. Now let's look at this more when it comes to like currency and money. Let's say we have $5 and a fidget spinner is $5 and so is slime. If we buy the fidget spinners, we can't buy the slime, right? So there's an opportunity cost, and we have to make sure that whatever we buy, the benefit for buying that or the benefit for whatever opportunity we pick is greater than that of what we're losing out on, right? So if you like fidget spinners better, then the opportunity cost for buying a fidget spinner over slime is good. Now, the last topic we wanted to cover was inflation. And this is the idea that prices rise over time. So after this lecture is done, I encourage you to go and ask your parents how much was a loaf of bread when they were kids. I guarantee you it's going to be a lot less than it was today. And so here's like a nice example to think of inflation. Let's say an economy has $10 in it, and there's only 10 fidget spinners in our economy. So then we would say the average price of each fidget spinner is about $1. But what if we increase the amount of money? Now we say there's $20 in the economy, but there's only 10 fidget spinners in the economy. So the amount of fidget spinners doesn't change. Now the average is $2. So the average price of a fidget spinner went up from $1 to $2. And so this is what we call inflation, the rise in prices over time. And now Rachit is going to be talking more about the stock market.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Richa. And before I begin talking about the stock market, guys, I really want to quickly remind you that if you have not yet filled out the Google form that we linked in the description for this video, please go ahead and fill that out. It'll help us know that you watched this video, first of all, and also will help us keep you up to date with stuff like the event that's going to be happening tomorrow and next week and all the other programs we're going to be having for FDA. So go ahead and fill out that Google form. One other thing I want to mention is if you have any questions, I know Richa covered a lot of information right now, especially about supply and demand. And although she gave a lot of examples, you may still have some questions in your head. So please go ahead and put those questions into the comment stream, and we're going to go ahead and look through them and do our best to answer some of them at the end of the video. All right. So the stock market is a pretty cool topic, and I'm sure a lot of you have heard about it in the media, in news, your parents discussing it, maybe even in school. And so we know you're curious about it. I was very, very curious about this at the beginning when I first learned about it. And there are some cool, simple examples that can give you guys an intuitive explanation of really what is the market and what's the purpose of it. So before really diving into the explanation of in detail, how does the stock market work? And I'll actually step back for a second while I give this explanation. The stock market essentially allows people like you and me to have some sort of ownership within a company. Now, the way this works, and I'm going to give you an example of you and a friend buying a pizza. So let's say you and your friend decide to buy a pizza, all right? And let's say this pizza has 10 slices. And because the store selling it just, makes a lot of sense, they decide to charge $10 for it. Now, imagine in this case that because you can't eat an entire pizza, you and your friend decide to go in together on that pizza, right? And each of you decides to basically pay for half of the pizza, meaning each of you pays about $5. In a sense, that means that you and your friend end up owning half of the pizza, right? And that's the idea that we're going to be using for the stock market. The only difference is instead of pizzas, we get to work with huge, huge companies like Apple, Tesla, Amazon, and more, right? Now, I'm going to go ahead and talk in more detail about what exactly a stock is before going into what the stock market is. So a stock market is really made up of shares of big companies, right? Companies like the ones I mentioned and many, many more. And the cool thing about shares is it allows people like you and me to take ownership within a big company that otherwise we couldn't own individually, right? Now, for example, if I am Apple, right, and I need some money to fund, maybe I'm trying to create a new store, right? And if I want some money to be able to pay for the store and haven't yet made any profits from that store, well, I might not have a lot of cash lying around. Well, one of the ways that I can raise some money to, maybe make a new product or make a new store, whatever I want to do as a business, is to sell some shares of my company out to the public. So what I can say is, look, I want to offer half of my company up for sale, right? Now, if we're talking about a big company like Apple, half of that company might be somewhere on the neighborhood of $500 billion. And in order to make it accessible for someone like you and me, what they then do is say, okay, look, if my company is worth, let's take an easy number, $1,000, and I want to sell parts of this company to, let's say, 10 people, right? Then I can essentially divide my company up into 10 shares, and then each person can pay 1/10 of the cost for one share. So let's say someone wants to buy half of my company. Well, then they'd want to buy 5 out of those 10 shares that I'm offering, and those 5 shares would end up costing them $500. And then they would basically own half of my pretend company. So that's what shares really does. It allows people to divide a company up into units of ownership, and then allows those people who own parts of the company to have a say in how the company operates, where the profits it makes are reinvested, and most importantly, also allows you as an investor, as a part owner of the company, to have a share in some of the profits made by the company. So we'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute, but let's go back to a stock market. Now, the goal of a stock market is to allow people to trade shares of these companies. Now, not every company allows anyone in the public to buy a small share of them, right? The companies that do are called publicly traded companies. And most of the big companies that you've heard of, like the ones I mentioned earlier, a lot of big technology companies and a lot of companies that sell cars and many others are publicly traded. Although not all of them are, and many other companies also use bonds to raise money, like I was mentioning earlier. And we'll talk a lot more. We'll talk in a lot more detail about bonds tomorrow, but just keep that in mind that bonds are another thing that companies sell in order to raise money for the things that they want to do. So now, right, Richard was talking about earlier, another big player in the economy are these investors, the people who tend to buy these shares. Now, if you want to buy a share, you pretty much become an investor in the company and have a stake in whether that company succeeds. We won't dive into too much detail about the kind of control that investors have over a company. That is something you can learn about online and something we may discuss in a future video. For the most part, as an investor, your goal is to buy shares of a company that is making a lot of profit. That's one example of what you might want to do. And then you are entitled to a little share of that profit based on how much of the company you own. A lot of the time, this is called dividends. Also, some people like to trade the shares and trade shares of a company themselves. They're not as interested in exactly how much money the company is making necessarily, but rather they want to buy a share of the company at a low price. Say someone buys a share of my company at $10, and for whatever reason, again, reasons that we won't necessarily dive into, the price of one share of my company goes from $10 to $20 the next day. Well, then someone who owns a share of my company can go and sell it to someone on the stock market for $20 and then keep the difference as their profit. And this is what stock trading really refers to. So now moving on, you have likely heard about the amount of volatility in the stock market over the past few months, especially throughout March. When volatility refers to how much the stock market tends to move over a period of time. Now, a very stable stock market might not move more than 0.5% or 1% every day, but a very volatile market might move in tens of percents, meaning 10 or 20% of the market's price as a whole changes over the course of just a few days, right? A volatile market is affected by a bunch of different factors, right? And every market is affected by a bunch of factors. And as you'll continue to learn throughout these presentations, all the concepts essentially that Rich and I are talking about today and that will be presented tomorrow are interconnected in one way or another. So if not all of these words are familiar to you, that's okay. But just know that there are an absolute ton of factors that affect the price of stocks on the affect the price of shares of stock on the market and have impacts on our daily lives in other ways, right? So economic growth, we are on the verge of a recession, inflation, like which I talked about, interest rates, which you guys will learn more about tomorrow, and currency fluctuations, meaning the relative price of one country's money versus another country's money. So because stock markets tend to be very volatile relative to other things you can invest your money in, they are considered to be a sort of high risk, high reward type of investment. Now you'll learn more about bonds tomorrow. Bonds are an option that are a little bit lower risk and have a little bit lower reward, but investing in a company means that you get a share of the profits of that company. And two things can happen. If the company does really well, then you're going to make a lot of money because the money you invested into that company will end up being worth more. To give you guys an example, let's say I bought 1/10 of this imaginary company for $100. Now the company started off being worth $1,000, but let's say in the future they're able to sell it to millions of customers and they make billions of dollars. Well, then the company is no longer going to be worth $1,000. It might be worth $100 billion. The cool thing though is my share, which used to be worth 1/10 of the company, will most of the time still be worth 1/10 of the company. The thing is, at this point, 1/10 of the company might be worth a lot more money. So my $100 invested might turn into something like $10 billion. So the cool thing is your money can grow like that. The other problem is if the company ever fails and the company goes out of business, then your money's also gone. So that's a very, very big risk, along with the volatility that just comes day to day within the stock market, that people have to consider before investing money in the stock market or buying shares of a company. Will the stock market make you rich? Maybe, and there is a field of huge discussion, huge research, and I'm sure a lot of you will actually take some time to research more about this, yourselves. But just keep in mind that there is no one surefire strategy that will make you money on the stock market, and it is really worth your time to go and do your own research to learn a lot more detail about how it works, why it works the way it does, and see if there's a way for you to make money based on that. Cool. Now we're just going to dive into economic systems and what they look like around the world.
Awesome. So thank you, Rachit. So we're going to move on to economic systems and the types of economies you have around the world. So the first one we're going to talk about is the free market. So in a free market, prices are determined by unrestricted competition between private businesses. So this is when businesses are in control of the economy, right? People own the businesses. They have all the power to kind of pick what prices are. Competition is going to drive prices and features and how the economy progresses. There has actually never been a fully free market, so I can't really give you an example of what that would look like, but it's like when there's no restrictions, right? There's no laws that are stopping businesses from doing anything. It's kind of like a free-for-all. Everyone is on their own. So either you can make a lot of money because there's no restrictions, or if you don't do so well, you don't really have like a safety net. A command economy is kind of like the opposite. So this is when there's so many restrictions that no one ends up owning anything. So the production, investment, prices, and incomes are determined centrally by the government. So this is when the government is in total control of the economy. They say how much of fidget spinners you should produce, how much money will you use, what is the price of the fidget spinners going to be. So there's no such thing as competition because like the government has total control. The closest example I can give you was a long time ago when Russia had a command economy right before their revolution, and they had it where the Russian government controlled everything, including like their farming to any other type of business they had running. Lastly, we're going to talk about a mixed economy. This is usually some blend of a market, of a free market, and a government-driven command economy. And most economies are actually mixed. I can't think of a single country around the world that doesn't have some sort of a mixed economy. Of course, they're on different scales, right? So the US leans a little bit more towards a freer market. So the government has less controls and restrictions on companies, but it's still a mixed economy because the government does have a say about what happens in the economy. Just like we mentioned, it was a big actor in the economy. And now Rachit is going to talk about the GDP.
Awesome, thank you, Richa. And one thing before I really dive into GDP is if you guys are having a hard time following anything that Richa and I are saying, again, pop your questions in the comment stream. We will check it out at the end of the presentation. We also, there's a slight chance that we'll run a little bit over, so feel free to stay for longer if you can. And one other great thing is that if anything we said doesn't make sense, two things, you're gonna have access to this presentation after the fact, and you will also have access to a recorded version of the entirety of this live stream after it's completed. So you can always feel free to refer back to this, refer back to portions of the thing that didn't make complete sense during the presentation itself. And again, if you have any specific questions about things that go a little bit further than what we're talking about, feel free to ask in the comments. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and dive into what is GDP. So first of all, what does GDP stand for? It stands for Gross Domestic Product. Now, we talked a lot about economies, how they work, the different people that, or the different groups that interact within an economy, a stock market, how to somehow value the company. But what we didn't talk about is, okay, if you're talking about the entire United States economy, well, how exactly do you measure the size of the economy? One thing you guys will learn as you dive a little bit deeper into economics is that there are always multiple ways of doing things. It's not necessarily a complete, there's not necessarily only one way or one correct way of measuring something or arguing about something. And that's why debate really comes up a lot when we're talking about economics. But GDP is one of the most widely used measures of the size of an economy. And so we'll talk in detail about it today. So gross domestic product tries to measure the value of the economic activity within a country and is usually measured year by year. So for example, in the same way that we talk about the population of a country and try to measure that in some sense every year, even though the census happens every 10 years, we try to have an estimate of what the country's population was every year. GDP is also a calculation that's done in detail by different government agencies to try and keep track of whether the policies and the laws that the government is passing are helping the economy and making sure it's continuing to grow and serve its country's people. Now, how exactly do we measure the size of an economy? Now, let me give you guys an example to show you why this might be a hard question to answer. Let's say in 2015, a car company decides to create a car. Now, what the car company has done is they have created value by putting together a bunch of different resources. And this ties into the idea we brought up at the very beginning, that there are certain resources that on their own necessarily don't bring much value to humans. But if we put them together into a form that is useful, then we are creating value out of these resources. So let's say the car company takes a bunch of skilled workers and a bunch of metal and other resources and combines them together essentially into a car. That's a much more complicated process, but the idea is we've created value through these resources. Now let's say that that car is sold for $10,000. Now it's a cheap car, but let's say it's sold for $10,000 to keep our example simple. Now in this situation, we've essentially created about $10,000 worth of value in the year 2015. Now here's where it gets complicated. Let's say in 2018, the person who first bought that car says, you know what, I want to go get a new car. And first they decide to sell the car that they bought in 2015. Now, if they sell that car that they bought for $10,000 for $5,000, let's say in 2018, does that mean that they're creating another $5,000 worth of value? Now, this might be up to a little bit of debate, but most people would agree that no, they're not necessarily creating any new value for the economy that this car is being resold in. And that's where a lot of gray areas come up and we're not always 100% sure of how to measure. But let's talk about GDP specifically. GDP, for example, would decide that no, the resold car does not count as new value brought to the economy. Another thing is we can talk about the actual definition of GDP. What kind of things play into the calculation of GDP? The first thing is consumption. Consumption refers to the purchasing activities that you and I do as consumers within the economy. So if you decide to go and buy a brand new smartphone, for example, that would count within the consumption category of GDP. This is how we kind of keep track of the new value that's made through services and products within an economy. So if Apple, for example, decides to create a smartphone and then we decide to buy it, then that would come into the consumption portion. Another huge part is investment. Now, businesses like, again, Apple, for example, typically have to put money into their business's operations. This might mean, for example, building a new headquarters in their home city. If this happens, this counts within the investment portion of the GDP because value is being created by, for example, creating construction jobs when they're creating that new company headquarters. Another one is government spending, and Richa will go over this later in the presentation, but you'll see that government spending is actually a huge, huge part of our economy because our government is so big that actions of the government tend to have massive impact on the economy as a whole, much more than you and I could have individually. And that's why we include government spending as its own little factor within GDP. And the fourth thing that counts in GDP, and I'm not going to dive into too much detail, is exports minus imports. To give you quick definitions, exports refers to things that are made, things of value that are made within the United States and then sold to another country. Imports are things that are made in another country and brought within the United States. The way I want you to think of this is if something is made within the United States and sold to another country, we're kind of bringing money into the US by creating value here and then getting someone else from outside to pay us. On the other hand, if we're importing something, what we're really doing is we're letting another country create value and give it to us, but we're sending money out of our country, which is why imports actually decreases GDP, but exports increase our GDP. And you can see that within the equation. Exports is a positive number while we subtract the value of the imports. Again, if that doesn't make complete sense, there are a ton of explanations online. You can refer back to this explanation and ask us questions if you have anything more within the comments. Next thing we're going to talk about is taxes. Now, taxes are extremely relevant to pretty much everyone in an economy, especially individual consumers. And we're going to talk about what taxes are, generally how they work, what their purpose is, and finally, what really, how they really work and how the bracketing structure for income tax works. And that's going to be something that'll be important for you eventually when you get a job and end up having to pay taxes. First thing we want to talk about is what is a tax in general? I'll step back for a second. So a tax is a price that you essentially pay on top of, well, the way you guys may have seen it before is the sales tax. If you go to the store and try to buy a $10 item, you might see a 10% tax on top of that. And that's called a sales tax. It's one kind of tax that is charged on individual consumer items that we can go out and buy. And this is one form of tax. Another form of tax, a really big one, is income tax. And when someone makes money, right, let's say I make $100, then the government will actually say, hey, you know what, I actually want a share of your income because you were using a bunch of my resources in order to have a job and live in my country. I am somehow entitled, somewhat entitled to some of the money that you're making as a member of my economy. We'll talk more in detail in just a second. But before I go into the types of taxes that I mentioned, like the sales tax, the income tax, I want to tell you a different kind of categorization of taxes. Now I'm going to take this slow because this isn't always very obvious, right? The first kind of category of taxes is progressive taxes. Now this kind of category of taxes is interesting because it allows the people who are making more money to be taxed at a higher rate. One example of a state that uses this is California, and New York is another example that has a progressive income tax. So that means that if you are making less money, you will have to pay a smaller percentage of your income as a tax than will someone who is making more money. Logically and intuitively, this seems to make a little bit of sense because the people who are making more money have more money, even if they end up paying a little bit more tax. Another example is something that people like to talk about as regressive or flat taxes. Now, I'm going to go really, really slowly with this one because this doesn't always make sense on first glance. Now, what progressive taxes did was it said that, look, if you're making anywhere up to, for example, let's take a simple example, up to $10,000, then you will be taxed at 10%, meaning you have to pay 10% of that $10,000 to the government. Then let's say instead, if you're making anywhere up to $50,000, you'll have to pay 20% of your income to the government. And I'll go into a little bit more detail because there are some nuances here, but I'll talk about those in a second. So progressive taxes increase the tax rate as you're going up. But here's the issue. If we have a flat tax, a flat tax meaning we give, no matter how much income you're making, we charge you the same percentage of tax, then what ends up happening is it actually seems to impact people who make less money more, which is why we call them regressive. And I'll give you an example of what this really means. So let's say there are two people, we're gonna call them Bob and Sally. If Bob is making, for example, $10,000 a year, and he happens to spend $1,000 a year on taxes, then Bob ends up paying essentially 10% of his annual income in taxes. Specifically, I'm talking about sales tax. So let's say Bob buys $5,000 worth of things a year. He pays a 20% sales tax on everything he buys. So he pays $1,000 in sales tax. Let's say with Sally, on the other hand, Sally makes $100,000 a year. Now, even though Sally makes 10 times as much income as Bob does, Sally won't necessarily be spending 10 times as much as Bob is spending. It's more likely that Sally spends a little bit more money than Bob does. Maybe instead of $5,000 of spending, Sally spends $15,000. But let's take a step back, and to make this simpler, let's assume that Sally spends the same amount of money as Bob, right, on regular things, whether it's clothes or food or stuff throughout the year. Here's the thing. If Sally spends $5,000 a year, and she pays, as a result, $1,000 in sales tax every year, then Sally pays essentially only 1% of her annual income in sales tax because Sally's making $100,000 and paying 1% in sales tax. Even though for both Sally and Bob, they're paying a 20% sales tax, that 20% makes up 1% of Sally's annual income, while it ends up making 10% of Bob's annual income. If that doesn't make sense, go through the recording again and listen to the explanation. You can find explanations like this online, but what you can essentially see is the intuition here is that a flat tax ends up being a bit regressive, meaning that it seems to impact the people who make less money more. So moving on, there are multiple different types of taxes, but the government's, and they are the main source of income for the government. So all the things that government spends money on, like police departments, schools, many other things like the coronavirus stimulus package, most of this money, or a lot of this money, will come from taxes that they have collected. Where they get this tax also depends, and Richa will be talking more about this breakdown later, but there are many different types of taxes, as we mentioned. Sales tax, which is a tax that is applied on a lot of things that you can go out and buy at a store or a restaurant. And one thing I'll mention here is that sales tax differs across different states. So California has a 7.25% sales tax. What you might find interesting, though, is when you go to Walmart, for example, or any other store, you won't see 7.25% tax applied. You'll see something higher. That's because Alameda County, if you're in Fremont or in Alameda County, applies an additional county sales tax. And that means that when you're going to a store within this county, you actually end up paying more than 7.25%, sometimes 9.25%. There are many other types of taxes. The main important one is income tax. And I'll talk about what the tax bracket system means in a second. But there is federal income tax, the one that you pay to the federal government. There's also state income tax, which you pay to your own state, whether it's California, Washington, New York, wherever else. Right? And state income taxes differ across states depending on which state you're in. Federal income tax, on the other hand, is the same for everyone across the country. There are many, many other types of taxes. A few that we thought to mention are property tax, which you might pay if you have a house, corporate tax, which you might pay as a company making profits, and gift tax if you're giving really, really expensive gifts of hundreds of thousands of dollars to people. Okay, so I'm going to take this part slowly as well. This right here is an actual picture of what the federal income tax brackets look like for people within the United States. I'm fairly sure these numbers are as updated as possible, but you can always find this table online yourself. Now, what I want to explain to you here is let's take only the unmarried column. Let's say you're a single person living by yourself, working a job within the United States. What this table essentially says that, look, let's assume you're making, for ease, let's say you're making $30,000, right? What's going to happen is on the first $9,700 out of that $30,000, you're going to have to pay 10% of that as federal income tax. So basically, out of the first $9,700, you're going to pay 10%, which is $970 in federal income tax. But remember, you made $30,000 in total. Let's look at the next row, the row that says 12%. Well, the row that says 12% says that, look, if you're making anywhere between $9,701 and $39,475, then you actually pay 12% tax. This doesn't mean that on the entire $30,000, you're going to pay 12% tax. Not at all. What this means is that on the first $9,700, you're going to pay 10% of that as tax. And on the remaining $20,300, you'd pay 12% of that additionally as tax. So when you add together the two portions within the two brackets is what we call them, the two income brackets, then you can find out what your overall tax amount is. And the way the calculations work means that your effective tax rate, the amount of tax or the percentage of your overall income that you end up paying, is going to be lower than the percentage that you see for the bracket you fall in. So for example, if I make $30,000 a year, technically it seems like I fall in the 12% bracket, but my effective tax rate is actually going to end up being slightly below that. Now, there's a lot of talk about lowering taxes, and I'm not going to dive into too much detail because I know we're coming upon the end of this presentation. But essentially, if you lower taxes, you can imagine that the government is going to have less money to spend. And as a result, there are a lot of complicated factors that lead to people generally having less money to spend because the economy has less money. Sorry, I completely botched that. If you lower taxes, the people will generally have more money to spend, and the government will have less money to spend. But because people and the companies that are making profit have to give less of their money to the government, they get to keep more money. And you can see at the bottom, the government will have less money to spend on things like education, healthcare, and welfare. And because people will spend more, there's more money in circulation, which often leads to a little bit of inflation, which means prices increase for everybody. And Richard talked about inflation earlier in the presentation. You can learn a lot more about it yourself, but we'll be talking a little bit about this increase in the money supply tomorrow. On the other hand, if you raise taxes, naturally people like you and me will have less money to spend on things that we want to do. Companies will have to pay more of their profits in tax to the government, and as a result, they'll be able to hire fewer people because they don't have as much money to pay them. On the other hand, though, this money isn't going nowhere. It's going to be going to the government, which can then spend it on things like education, healthcare, welfare. And we'll talk a lot detail about what welfare looks like from the government tomorrow at the end of the presentation. But you should know that the government having more money typically means that they can improve situations for everybody. However, because people will spend less money, there's less money in circulation, inflation decreases, and prices will either stay the same, go down, or increase very, very slowly for everyone relative to how fast they would increase if we lowered the tax rate. Now, Rich is going to move on to some quick facts about the economy and the end of the presentation.
Thank you, Rachit. I know we're running a little bit over time, but if you guys could just hang in with us for another like 5-10 minutes, I swear we're almost done. So I'm going to be talking about quick facts about the economy. So these will be handy when you're using them in a debate round. Okay, so the first one is that the US GDP is about $21.729 trillion. So this is like the gross domestic product, the like amount of production or the amount that we make every year. And then we have a debt of $24.22 trillion. And in a little bit, I'll show you a graphic of the federal budget where I can explain how maybe that debt came to be. And then we have an unemployment of 20.6% today. So in April, 20.6%, but in February, it was only 4%. So just take a moment to think about that. In 2 months, the unemployment rate rose by over 16%. So let's break down unemployment a little bit to kind of like help you understand how that happened, because that relates to COVID-19. So the definition of unemployment is when a person who is not working, well, you would think unemployment was when a person is not working. But in actuality, the government has a more specific definition. And so they need to fall under these categories to be counted in the unemployment rate. So they want to have to work. And they have to have looked for work within the last 4 weeks. So if they haven't looked for work in the last 4 weeks, they're actually not counted as unemployed, and they're not in the unemployment rate. So like the number we saw earlier, they're not, people who haven't looked for work in the last 4 weeks have not been taken into account in this number. And what we call these people are marginally attached to the labor force, which just means that, you know, they got a little bit like they kind of lost hope that they could get a job. And so that's what we call them if they haven't actually looked for work in the 4 weeks, but they technically are still unemployed. It just doesn't go in the unemployment rate, but the government does report this in a different section. So we still know the numbers of how many people are actually called marginally attached to the labor force. And then how do we actually calculate the unemployment rate? It's going to be, we take the number of people unemployed based on the government's definition, and we divide it by the labor force, and that's going to give us a decimal, and then multiply it by 100, and you get your percent. So now we're going to talk a little bit about unemployment, the types of it. The first one is furlough, and what this means is it's a temporary leave of absence without pay due to the need of an employer. And so this is super, super important for right now, because most people that fall in this 16%, that number we calculated about the unemployment rate as it rose in the last 2 months, is actually because most of them are in furlough, which means that because of COVID-19, all the businesses shut down. And so they have to lay off employees because it would be too much of a cost to the business. And so the idea is that hopefully once COVID-19 kind of calms down and businesses start opening up again, all these people who were laid off will actually get their jobs back. But there are also other types of unemployment. So the first one is cyclical. So this is when the economy and company shrinks, causing layoffs. So this is like the general cycle of the economy, right? You have a boom and the economy grows, and then you'll have a recession where everything kind of shrinks and people will lose their jobs. So this is like a very normal cycle. Then you've got frictional. So this is when a worker voluntarily leaves their job and hasn't been able to find a new job. So it's like in this middle period between a worker leaving an old job and finding a new one. There's also structural, which is when there's a shift in the economy where the skills of the worker no longer match the employer needs. So there's one that's happened really recently in the last couple of years, and it's been in factories, how a lot of factory workers have lost their jobs due to automation and new technologies, and like robots and all of these things that can like automize the process so you don't need as many workers in a factory. There's also seasonal unemployment. So this is like based on the regular changes in a season. A great one is for farming. Farms will usually hire more people to work when it's like harvest season or planting season because they need to do it quickly. Otherwise, like the crops will go bad or they'll be planted late. But then once this is done, they'll lay off a lot of workers. So it's a seasonal thing based on the season. And the last one is long-term. And so this is a person who has been looking for work for more than 27 weeks and hasn't been able to find work, and we call this long-term unemployment. So now we're going to jump into some more statistics. The federal minimum wage is $7.25. So across the country, you have to be paid at least $7.25. But what's interesting to know is it's actually different per like county or state. So in San Francisco, for example, the minimum wage is actually $15. So the minimum wage can be greater in different places. It just can't be lower than the federal minimum wage. And this makes sense, right? Because San Francisco is a lot more costly to live in than in other places. And another cool fact is California's minimum wage is actually $13. So you see the difference in the minimum wage depending on the place, on a federal, state, and even like a county or city level. And one number that is kind of, I think, is like really sad and kind of brings things into perspective is the number of people in poverty is 38.1 million people. And that's a lot of people that are in poverty. So it's a hard fact to know, but it's something that can be useful in debates when you're talking about helping people and saying like, look at the amount of people that we can help. And like we've been talking about before, this is a little infographic on the federal budget. You don't need to read everything. You can pause it after the live video ends if you want to. But the main things that I just wanted to point out was look at the revenue, right? These are all the taxes. These are your individual income taxes over here. Then you've got your payroll, you've got your corporate tax here. And one thing, the big thing I want you to see is look at our revenue. The government earns $3.5 trillion in revenue. But we go over here to look at outlays, which is our costs, and we see we spend $4.4 trillion. And I hope you see the disparity. We only earn 3.5 trillion, but we spend 4.4. So about $1.1 trillion we spend when we don't actually have that money, and that's where our debt is kind of growing from. Some big things that we spend on is the defense, Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, and other different things that the government needs to spend money on. Of course, like education, all unemployment compensation, these are all in these other sections. So yeah, this is a cool infographic to kind of show you the federal budget. And so I know we've talked a lot about numbers, so we found another cute joke for you, and it says, let's not get obsessed with capital, I'm much better at lowercase. And so before we kind of close off, Rachit has a few ending thoughts and words for you. So thank you so much, Rachit.
Awesome. Give me just a second. And there we go. So thanks, Richa. And thank you again, all of you, for staying here throughout this presentation. I know it ran quite a bit longer than we expected to. But before, we have one question that I want to get to in a second. But the first thing I want to ask you guys is, after you've learned everything that we've talked about today, and, definitely you can dive into more detail about any of these topics and learn a ton more by going online yourself, by tuning into our other live lecture series coming up. But I want you guys to try and think and apply the concepts that we've talked to you about to the world that we see around yourself. Do you see prices going up when things get more popular? Do you see supply going up? Do you see demand going up? See if you can apply what you've learned. Maybe ask your parents to let you take a look at what taxes might look like for them, and try to use the knowledge that you've gained today and apply it somewhere, whether it's in a debate or whether in real life. And on that end, we have a big question that we want to ask you guys. Now, this is a hot topic in current political debate and economic debate. Should billionaires even exist? Or should we tax people that make that much money so much that no one can ever get that rich? Now, this, of course, is not at all trying to imply any views of Fremont Debate Academy or anyone that works with us, but we do want to mention that there are questions like this that we'd like you guys to think about, and it'll give you a better understanding of how economic systems work, why the people that exist today and the systems that exist today do, and how we might be able to take and use policies, laws that you'll learn about, and other kind of economic factors to change our world. With that, I'm going to go ahead and address a question actually first that was brought up by Misha Maswani. And she mentioned that, she asked, how low do we think the unemployment rate is going to go after the entire coronavirus situation kind of dies down? Now, although neither me nor Richa can give a definitive answer to that question, what we can say is we can talk a little bit about the factors that are going to affect it. Now, naturally, as the coronavirus situation kind of recovers, right? As we recover from it, as people are able to go back to businesses, fewer people are getting sick with vaccines and all that, businesses will be able to reopen. And as businesses reopen, people will get back to work, whether they're working in factories, restaurants, wherever else, right? Now, the great thing about this is people will be able to go back to their jobs. But the issue is that a lot of people So these people who are furloughed by companies will be able to go back to their jobs. The issue is that a lot of people who work for smaller businesses oftentimes may have found that their small business that they used to work at actually went out of business because it wasn't able to stay afloat during coronavirus. And we're seeing this happen more and more across the country. So we do expect to see that a lot of people will have found their job no longer exists after the situation dies down and shelter in place is phased out, essentially. So we're not exactly sure how much it will decrease. We know that this will have a lasting impact for a very long time. And we know that the impact, economic impact that coronavirus is having is going to last far beyond after shelter in place is phased out. And it's also a huge humanitarian crisis, right? So we have to weigh the different priorities that people have between protecting the economy, taking care of businesses, and of course, saving people and saving lives. Hope that helps answer the question and give you some insight on the factors that will affect their unemployment rate. And before we end off, two things again I'm going to mention. One thing I'm going to mention first is that please go ahead and fill out the Google form that's linked. We really want to make sure we can keep you up to date with information. We know some new people are tuning in, some people are tuning out. But before you do, please fill out that form. Another thing I want to mention is where can you learn more? First and foremost, we are going to be having another live lecture series tomorrow, which is going to be building off of everything we talked about today. And we'll also be giving you guys some more context about how the concepts we talked about relate directly to the situation that we're in right now. A lot of you may have heard about the $2 trillion stimulus package that the US government passed recently, and we'll be diving into a lot of detail about that and a bunch of other topics tomorrow. So please tune back in, especially if you found this interesting, and let your other friends know so that they can learn about this stuff too. Also, we highly suggest you guys to check out our website online. We have a few resources on there and a lot of stuff you can go through to see what Fremont Debate Academy has done in the past. Feel free to go to Facebook, like our Facebook page, check out our Instagram profile as well. We're going to be posting there more often soon. And again, check out this YouTube channel because as a lot of the comments were asking, yes, this video and this presentation will be posted and accessible by all of you after the presentation is over. So if you have any questions about something you heard about today, you'll be able to refer back to everything we said and also be able to go through this presentation at your own convenience by looking at it on Google Slides. So we'll be sharing that link in the comments soon. A lot of this content is going to be posted on Facebook, etc. And one last thing I want to mention is that if you are a high schooler and want to start up a program for Fremont Debate Academy in your own school, we've worked with kids across the country and across the world, really, to start up programs using the curriculum content and experience that we have starting programs locally. If you have any interest or know anyone who might want to start up a program, we would absolutely love to get in touch with them and learn more about their situation and see if we can educate more kids across the world. With that, thank you so much, everybody, for being here. We've seen an extreme amount of support. We had a lot of people watching, a lot of people supporting our video in the background. And I want to mention that there has been a lot of work going on in the background for the past few weeks preparing for this in terms of getting logistics, content, and marketing ready for this event. And I'm just extremely happy to say that we were able to bring this value to each of you today and hope to see you all in the coming few weeks as well. Thank you very, very much, everybody. Really quickly, I saw a question about when the other live videos were. The next one is going to be tomorrow, like Rachit said. It's going to be on a follow-up to this one on economics and really relating it to how our economy has been responding to COVID-19. So it's tomorrow, same time, 4 to 5. And then next week, we'll have 2 lecture series on politics. And those will be also on Tuesday and Wednesday of next week from 4 to 5. If you guys want the links are posted on our Facebook page, just like today's was. If you are not on the Facebook page, feel free to go to this presentation, you'll find the links. And if you didn't get the email about this event, then fill out that form like I was mentioning earlier, and you will get updates about all the events that Richa was mentioning and many more. All right, I think we're good to go. Thank you guys, take care.